Hi. So this is part 2 of chapter 5, our study on populations. And in part 1, we looked at how populations can be impacted by different things. Some of the factors that can influence those, the density, which is the number in a population. So we had like crowding and stress, competition for resources, parasitism, disease, and then crowding and stress that changes like birth rates, death rates, things like that. And so today we'll continue with that, and we're looking at human population growth, a little bit closer at it, and the history of population growth. So when there's not been a lot of changes until the 1700s. So if we look at today's population, even there are several things that influence different on different continents, different countries. It's all based on either their resources or sometimes disease. We have this current epidemic of COVID-19, and we can see how disease and things like that can impact a population growth. But then also other things that influence population growth is the amount of resources or the environment. So kind of keep those things in mind. The study of human population sizes is called demography. And here we have a graph that shows going from about 4000 BC to 2000 AD. So that's about 6,000 years. You've got 4,000 to here, and then 2,000, so over about 6,000 years. You don't really see a change in the population over time, and so people have been around a long time, but then relatively, we would call this a steady state for population growth if we were looking at or describing this curve. And then around here, this is about the 14th century. And I had you look at a video clip in the last part 1 about Black Death, bubonic plague occurred in the 14th century. And so here you have the population, whatever it was, world population at that time, it killed hundreds, thousands of people. In fact, like the European population decreased by almost 60%, but you have a drastic dip here. So I talked to you about that before in part 1, that whenever you see these dramatic changes, it's a decline was usually some kind of catastrophic event, either volcanic activity, tidal waves, something in that nature, or disease. And typically, if it falls off that sharply, we're looking at disease. And in this case, it was bubonic plague. But then we see this sharp growth, which we described as an exponential growth. So exponential growth is when you have ideal conditions. There's plenty of food, plenty of space, there's no disease, there's no competition. And so you get this dramatic increase of numbers. What were some things that contributed to that? Because, why didn't you have that here? One thing, the Industrial Revolution, which means that your farmers, there were machines that were built, so farmers could plant more crops. They could harvest that with machines, where before you may have had individuals growing a garden and maybe farming maybe 5 to 10 acres, but when they had to plow that either by mule, and work the land that way and didn't have machinery, they were limited on how much that they could grow. If you're limited on food, then that's going to limit your population growth, because not enough food, then you're not going to, people are going to go hungry, and then you're going to have disease because their body systems are weaker, and then they'll die. So the Industrial Revolution, with the production of machines that help to maximize the production of food and even clothing and other necessities. And then another significant advance was in health. So in 1930s and 40s, you had the discovery of penicillin, which that dramatically influenced the health population and people surviving. Before, you would have young babies when they were born would die many times from pneumonia because there's no way to treat it. So any bacterial infections, cuts and scrapes that might cause gangrene, people would die from that. But with the discovery of penicillin and the development of antibiotics, you had a significant change in the health of populations. And so now, because people were living longer and there's plenty of food, so more people being born, so that drastically increased the population. So if we look at the demographics too, it's also the study of not only current populations, but what are the populations going to do like in the future. So we can try to predict those things based on just general trends. There's no way to know for sure, but what one of the trend is, they base that on what's kind of going on in that area at the current time. And if those things continue, then what would the population be? So in looking at Africa in 2005, compared to the predicted population in 2050. So this is just about doubled. What could we kind of guess as to what would change in Africa that substantially in that length of time? Well, in Africa's plagued with hunger, but then also disease, malaria. You have a large number of people that are born with sickle cell disease. That's a genetic disorder. And so that is a large population, African populations with sickle cell anemia. But then the malaria and then the hunger would contribute to these lower numbers. But let's say in the future, and also AIDS in Africa. So, in their future predictions, you might think that they were considering that there's going to be find a cure for AIDS or better treatments for sickle cell disease, and even maybe some way to help the population of Africa be able to sustain themselves with agricultural practices and things. And so, we can kind of consider those things if we're wanting to hypothesize about how they got these numbers. Asia hasn't really, and Asia has a large population, one of the largest in 2005 worldwide, but then it has increased, but if we look at it, hasn't doubled like Africa did. Australia, pretty much the same. Europe, North and South America's, their numbers, North America and South America, everything's a little bit larger, except for Europe. We might hypothesize it. Europe is pretty densely populated if we think about number of people per footage or land space. And so when you don't have a lot of places to expand, that's going to limit your population numbers and how many can reasonably, the carrying capacity of that environment. So then this slide just tells a little bit about projected populations. And so we've got over 7 billion people in the world now. If we're thinking about the coronavirus or the COVID-19, we go back to this graph. it'll be interesting to see what the impact of this disease, this pandemic, is going to be on the populations. Did it set things back? Will we rebound from that? How long will that take? Um, again, when we look at population pyramids, one of the things that you need to notice, these are two comparisons. So Sweden and Kenya is in Africa. So Sweden is what we consider a developed country. So you see this little cylindrical graph. So if you look at the births, and the blue is boys and the females, if we look at the number of births and compare that all the way up, it's pretty consistent numbers in the populations. And then the death rate, they're living longer. So in a developed country, you have better food, better resources, more access to medical care. And so that can, because of that, your population doesn't drastically change. If we're looking at what we consider an underdeveloped country, they have limited resources, limited food, limited medicine. So you see small numbers in the age of this population. So if we go across here, about age 45, and we look at the number of course, there's a lot of war and things like that, tribal problems. So the number of males to females, there's a lot larger number of females than the males here. And in developed countries, it's pretty well equal. But here we do have a large number of births, but then those children surviving, to an older age is not, the percentages aren't as good as like in a developed country, because most of these, since we see this kind of a stable number percentages wise, so this describes this underdeveloped country with a lack of food, probably medicine, so large birth rate, but then also large death rate, which gives you this steep kind of incline on your pyramid. Here's and I had you look at population pyramids, and it may explain it a little bit more. Even with these demographic pyramids, there's one place in the video clip that talks about, you can even tell, they did a population pyramid of a country, and you could tell when they were at war. So a wartime, there was a decrease in the male population, a dramatic, and then it rebounded afterwards. But again, you see the population of Africa, you're going to see this little steep pyramid, underdeveloped, slow growth, United States. This is just your developed country, pretty much cylindrical here, and negative growth. So this would be where you see a small base. So you have to think, this is the future of your population. So, in Africa, that would be a substantial population if you didn't have disease and famine and things like that. If these all survive to live to their 60s and 70s, should have a pretty large population. But in Japan, limited space, so it's harder to support a large family, and so you have a smaller number of births, and so that actually the population is over time is going to decrease, because as these die and then there's not as many being born, then your population numbers will decrease. Looking at world populations, this is a 2000 graph, pretty triangular here, a steeper little slope with your underdeveloped or less developed regions of the world, and then again the cylindrical is going to show you a developed country, because you're looking at pretty much the same birth rates as, middle age. You don't see a lot of changes. And then your least developed countries are going to have these large numbers of births and then large death rates. So people aren't going to survive because no medicine, no food. When we look at populations can only bring to the gene pool, the individuals that make up a population. You only have certain traits that you bring into that. If we look at Native American Indians and some of their characteristics of their alleles, they have the high cheekbones, and the males have very little facial hair, the olive skin, the dark hair, straight. If we look at those traits, within that population, why don't they have blue eyes or blonde hair? It's because they don't have those alleles or traits present to then be expressed in the offspring. So before you can see a trait in an offspring, those genes have to be present. Now, some things can happen to make those appear, like for instance, mutations can occur, but mutations take a long time to express themselves in the whole population. So you see them randomly at first, but we'll get back to that in a minute. If we look at the variation in a population, so here we've got some brown frogs, and we've got these little green frogs and this environment here. If we look at the frequency of the genes, this is going back to our chapter when we talked a little bit about genetics, the intro. We talked about dominant genes and recessive genes. We can only visually see the phenotype or the physical characteristics of this being brown. But if we were to look at the alleles are recessive, two little recessive genes. Dominant gene is green. Now here in this one, it's green, that's its phenotype. Its genotype, we really don't know until we try to do some crosses and things. In this environment, it's pretty equal number distribution of the alleles. So if we look at percentages here, the recessive gene to the dominant gene, you do slightly see, even in an environment that has no environmental pressures, you see that equal distribution. And so here it's pretty equal, about 58%, 41%. But if, let's say there are environmental pressures, and let's say you go through a drought and this nice green grass dies because there's very little water and there's not as much camouflage for the green ones. And so maybe your recessive brown frogs, they're less noticed by predators. And so a decrease in the number of the green frogs because of an environmental pressure would make maybe the gene frequencies change, because now this might become the dominant allele or trait. So the environment, and keep that in mind, the environment really can impact the changes of the characteristics of a population. So changes in genes or alleles can be caused by a couple of factors, either immigration, organisms moving into a population, or immigration, which is organisms moving out of population or out of an area. And then the next thing I want to talk to you about is when organisms become isolated from the rest of the population. When you get a chance, go to the slides and look at the pocket mice. It's a really short video clip, but this is a really good video, an actual case of pocket mice, and how long it took the alleles or the traits in its population to change within a very short period of time. and we'll talk about reproductive pressures. So the reproductive pressure is whatever traits that an organism has that allows it to survive and get a mate and reproduce. If those are favorable or positive traits, then you're going to see those more and more. So the pocket mouse really does a really good job of talking about how new species can arise or how organisms change because of environmental pressures. So really take a look at that. Bio means life, diversity, all the different changes and the different varieties. So if we look at this pie graph, protists are one-celled organisms. They reproduce asexually. And they don't really change a lot. We don't have a lot of different species of protists. Plants, 18%, fungi, bacteria, fungi or decomposers. They reproduce asexually and sexually. Bacteria, they reproduce asexually by binary fission. If we look at their percentages, 0.3% of all the organisms. They have changed very, very little over hundreds of thousands of years because they reproduce asexually. There's not a lot of ways that their genes that they have change, only through mutation, and most mutations are probably negative. There's a few positive mutations that enable an organism to become better able to survive, but they have changed very little. When I say other animals, so if we include diversity in animals, because animals, even plants, can reproduce asexually and sexually, but insects and animals produce sexually. So if we combine these numbers, you've got 73%, 74% of organisms that reproduce sexually. So sexual reproduction allows for lots of variety in the offspring, and lots of even those recessive genes that may not show in the parents, but then show up in the offspring. So that diversity allows animals to better be able to adapt to changes in the environment when there are changes present, just like the frogs and stuff. So having a variety is good, especially when the environment changes. Now, if the environment doesn't change, you don't have to have a variety, and we'll look at that in a little bit. But isolation, one way that a new species can form is when species become separated from their population. So let's say I had an original population of lizards here living on this mainland, and some of them, they were, crawling on this log, and it drifted to this isolated island that didn't have any lizards. And so there's plenty of food, plenty of space. It's, about the same temperature. So they thrive and they reproduce, and they start to have offspring. And then, so then after a while, you've got a pretty large population. But they've been isolated from the mainland. And over time, they may have, there may have been mutations or things to where they become very different compared to the ones on the mainland, even though we would say that these groups of lizards have what we call a common ancestor. They may be too different or too separated as far as genetically. They can no longer reproduce if you were to cross them. But this same thing, if you keep in mind, why did these even change at all? Think about, remember those alleles and the recessive traits. These lizards, the only thing that went with them was not the variety that was in the population, but only the variety of the alleles or the characteristics in their genetics. So once they were there, let's say if this was two blue-eyed lizards, and these are, you know, population of brown and blue and green-eyed lizards. If these had, let's say, a recessive trait for blue eyes and they landed here, there would never be any brown-eyed or green-eyed unless you had a mutation develop, because if they have a recessive gene, there's no way that they can get that characteristic or that trait unless some kind of mutation or something happens, because parents can only pass on to their offspring what traits or alleles that they have present in their own genes. So if we consider, when we look at the differences in organisms, we'll talk a lot about common ancestor. So a common ancestor, and let's say that you had this population, it's the same thing that happened with the lizards. Let's say you have this population of this animal that, for whatever reason, it may be that the population grew so big that the environment wouldn't support it. And so there's too much competition for space and food until a few of the animals migrated to a different area, and a few maybe over here migrated to a different area here. So over time, if they're separated long enough, then based on the environment is going to promote certain changes in characteristics, those physical characteristics or phenotypes. Selective pressures, like for breeding or whatever. So the differences in organisms could be based on the environment. Like rabbits that live in Canada, the ears are really short because a lot of heat is lost from their ears. But in the desert, the rabbits in the desert, their ears are huge because they need to get rid of a lot of heat. So the environment can change the appearance because of whatever traits that an organism has that makes it best suited for that environment. That's going to allow them to survive, reproduce, and pass that trait on to their offspring. So over time, now, how do we know that this is a common ancestor of these? Well, now we can look at genetics, just like you can do the ancestry.com. They look at the genetics to see, where do you share the most similar genes with? You know, what's your closest ancestor? And so that's how they would know that. And we'll look at more, our next chapter, we're going to go from this, we're going to go back to genetics and look at, now that you know how the environment can influence what alleles or phenotypes or how traits are expressed, we're going to look at the genes a little bit closer. So genetic barriers can, geographic isolations. So you have the different continents, you know, you have a lot of animals that can't get from here to here or from here to here because of the separation of the ocean. When just as the lizards got isolated on the island, geographic isolations can also occur because of earthquakes that can separate, or let's say there's a river that eventually, you know, gets wider and wider, and it separates organisms. They've done some studies of the Grand Canyon, animals living on one side of the canyon and the other, and you know, over time they become separated. So, and you can look at how closely related they are and determine about how long ago that was. And we'll look at that a little bit closer when we get to genetics. But even things like temperature can cause, like if you have animals that need warm temperatures, and because they don't have a lot of fur, or maybe reptiles or amphibians, they would need to live in areas where it was very warm, especially if you're a large reptile like alligators, crocodiles. Um, if you can go underground, snakes and things, they can live in colder climates, but temperature can also isolate. So this is called temporal barriers, can isolate organisms. And then this can also, the temperatures can also cause changes in the reproductive cycles. Like certain animals, if you're living in a cold, animals that live in colder areas, they may hibernate during the winter. So when the spring comes, the females are eating, and they're ovulating, and so the breeding time would be early, so that then when they have their offspring, they have time to eat and grow before the next, cold spell hits, when there's no food or very little food. So the reproductive cycles may even be controlled by, or timing can be influenced by, those temperatures. So if we go back to your geography lesson about the idea of Pangea, and how did these animals get from one place to another? Well, when we talk about common ancestors, there is fossil evidence of similar organisms, like in the same areas where you would put these continents together. They also have rock formations and fossil formations that are in similar areas. For instance, one of the things, Charles Darwin had read books about geology, and knew something about geological formations and how the earth was changing over time, and rocks and sedimentary rocks and things like that. And when he traveled to Africa, he saw the ostrich, and around the tip of South America, and saw the ray, and then Australia and the emu. He, had the idea that these had a common ancestor. And this could be reasonably true if you agree that, this is a possibility too. So similar fossils found, even dinosaurs fossils. So you have similar organisms. Now, these are not closely related enough to where you could breed them together. But genetically, if you look at their DNA, they are very similar, which could reasonably lead you to the conclusion that they have a common ancestor. Speciation, going back to the lizards, and the same thing with these birds. Speciation, different species of the ostrich and the ray, that was because of geographic isolation. And so geographic isolation really promotes this new distinct species. Some other things can cause that too. Talked about the temperature, because that isolates organisms. But there's some other things, even among the same species, you can get isolating mechanisms. So for instance, populations, they can isolate themselves. Sometimes you have groups of people that do that. They may live in a certain area of the world, and we have different groups of Indian populations that are still live on reservations and things. And so animals sometimes have these isolating mechanisms too. There's a flamingo mating dance where they perform a little dance. The blue-footed boobies, they have a little dance too. One of their dances is they'll raise their feet up so that the male does the dance, and so the female will raise her feet up so that, or I'm sorry, the male will raise his feet up to show the female how blue his feet are. And usually the bluer the feet are, that he's more likely to be selected as a mate by the female. So these behavioral barriers are can produce this isolation too. But birds have some really elaborate, sometimes the mating dances, but even the songs. You have the vocal songs and things to attract a mate. But these are called courtship behaviors. Why do animals have this? So when you see these courtship behaviors, it's because there's some reproductive pressures on the female. It's going to cost the female something to reproduce. So if you have plenty of food, plenty of space, plenty of everything, you don't have to compete for a mate. But let's say that the female, in order for her to reproduce, she's going to have to consume good food, be healthy, but then after she either lays the eggs, or let's say it's a mammal of some kind that has a litter of offspring, that female has to stay with those young in order to ensure that they get old enough to where they can start to do things on their own. But because of that, she is very vulnerable to predators, and so she has what's called limited potential in her lifespan, because or even the survival of her young, because of those. So because she has this more of pressure, reproductive pressure, because of those circumstances, she's pretty picky about what male. And what male does she want? She wants the healthiest male. So back to the flamingo. The flamingos, they eat shrimp, and the shrimp will make their feathers pink. So the pinker the feathers, the healthier typically their diet has been. And so females will select the flamingos that have the brightest, pinkest feathers in order to, because the idea is that's a really healthy male, and he's going to pass whatever those healthy genes or whatever makes him stronger to the offspring. And here you have a bird that's showing off, a male that's showing off its red-breasted there, and to attract the female. And typically in birds, that's true. The male is much more colorful than the female. And so some of those displays, either in song or dance, is kind of unique. But even other animals, like lions, the male will hunt and lay a kill at the feet of the female to show that he's a good provider of food. But now, after they mate, female's the one that usually hunts for the food. But when it's between two males, like two males may compete in baboons, you have two males that will fight and compete to be the dominant male. That's called intrasexual selection. It's when it's between males, fighting among males. Intersexual selection, this is where the male typically is trying to attract the female, because again, the females, because of those environmental pressures, there may be limited food, it may be there may be several reasons. It may be that there's a large number of predators, but whenever you see environmental pressures, you're going to see more competition as far as for the mates. So, but if we look at sexual selection, the idea of sexual selection, this occurs when there are those conditions that may not be favorable. There's a lot of risk to the female Uh, and so whenever you see that, a lot of the traits within that population is um, the same. You know, it's like with the flamingos. I don't know if anybody ever thinks of anything other than flamingos being pink. They can be, but uh, that's the color we think because that's what their sexual selection and there's pressures that cause that. If you had a population that didn't have any selective pressures, there's plenty of food, plenty of space, then you would see more of a variety and an equal distribution of alleles or traits. But again, when you have those selective pressures um, brought about by either environment or even others within the population competing, you're going to see a more common um, dominant allele than you would in something where there was less competition. So our next thing, well, the last part we'll look at is how some other things that can influence population size and changes in population, and that will be part 3.